sehr geehrte Frau Professorin Deitelhoff, sehr geehrter Herr Dr. Wirth, sehr geehrter Herr Abgeordneter McAllister und Herr Dr. Brender. Meine Damen und Herren, ich heiße Sie alle sehr herzlich willkommen hier aus der Hessischen Landesvertretung in Brüssel zu unserer nächsten digitalen Veranstaltung in der Reihe des Crisis Talks, heute zu dem Thema die EU und der Indo-Pazifische Raum. Gemeinsame Strategie in der Krise. In der Reihe Crisis Talks der hessischen Ministerin für Bundes- und Europaangelegenheiten Lucia Puttrich, des Leibniz Forschungsverbandes
The European Union tends to engage in a kind of navel gazing when seeing the world and to believe that everybody is watching us at the center of the world. The United States are being active in the Indo-Pacific for a long time. And when we think about the stir of the past weeks regarding the acquisition of atomic submarines, then we know that the United Kingdom, the US and Australia concluded a deal with Great Britain and not with France. This has affected us and raised the question regarding our position. What are our cooperations, what are our connections, and what are our perspectives? An Indo-Pacific strategy has been elaborated, which will be in the heart of our discussion today. But things must not remain at discussion level. The European Union is a union of democratic states. And democratic states are not in a majority worldwide, and it is therefore important to be aware of the democratic states in the Indian Pacific region, like Taiwan. The US provide a guarantee for security. And what would the EU be doing if Taiwan was in danger? What would we do? What would be our position should China attack Taiwan? The Commission has made clear its wish to be a geopolitical commission. This means thinking outside the box, not wearing blinkers and strategies for large parts of the world. I wish you now very interesting insights and foresights, and not only the conclusion of a status quo, but also looking forward regarding how we can handle our challenges in the future together as a strong European Union. Thank you very much for these welcoming words. My name is Rebecca Schmidt. I'm head of the Research Center for Normative Orders of Goethe University, Frankfurt. And together, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Deitelhoff, our participants, and now please let me give the word to Mr. Christian Wirth. Then we will have the panel discussion. And of course, you're allowed to ask your questions. As you can see here, ask your questions to our guests. And the address is streamline@lv brussels.hessen.de. And you can also call us 0032. And we are looking forward to your input. Of course, this needs no presentation. The Indo-Pacific region is one of the most important regions of the world. On Friday and Saturday, we could see on television that there had been maneuvers for the first time in 20 years with the participation of Germany and Japan. And the European Union, during the presentation of its common strategy, has launched different initiatives. And the same day, it had a multilateral defense alliance from Australia, the US, and Great Britain. So what are the opportunities and what are the challenges for the European Union in the Indo-Pacific? On Wednesday, will be presented the strategic compass. So that is a really intensive, interesting discussion, and we want to start to launch this discussion together with our high-ranking panelists. We have Dr. Nicole Deitelhoff, Leibniz Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, Goethe University Frankfurt. Then we have Dr. Christian Wirth, Research Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. And he did his PhD in International Studies in Tokyo. His current research is working on traditional and not traditional security policies and maritime safety in the Asia-Pacific region. So as you see, it's a real expert regarding the topic that interests us today. I wish you a very warm welcome, and now we're looking forward to your keynote, Mr. Wirth. Dear Minister, dear Professor Deitelhoff, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here in this expert round on the question the EU and the Indo-Pacific region, common strategy in a crisis. As already said, this question has been raised by many observers, not by all, after the Australian government of Prime Minister Morrison, on the same day that the EU presented its Indo-Pacific cooperation strategy, surprisingly cancelled a contract for the purchase of 12 French submarines and at the same time presented a new security partnership with the USA and Great Britain. Transfer of technology. This also contains a memorandum of understanding regarding the delivery of atomic submarines by the USA or Great Britain. So, in addition to the crisis of confidence between Paris and Canberra, the questions are, why this further partnership? What about European and Western unity vis-à-vis China? And what does this development mean for the European Indo-Pacific strategy? In order to answer these questions, two more fundamental aspects need to be explained first. First of all, what is a crisis and what exactly is currently being in a crisis? Crises reveal themselves in the form of widely accepted narratives. These crises arise because people and organizations combine their observations of a wide variety of objectively existing problems into explanations that make sense to them and are therefore highly simplified and not necessarily accurate. What exactly the problem is and how it can be solved is thus determined by those who dominate the crisis narrative. It is therefore crucial to know who exactly, on the basis of which motivations, presents which object is being in a crisis. And to be clear, the European Indo-Pacific cooperation strategy is not in crisis. However, the fact that we are asking this question at all shows that there are ambiguities and perhaps even contradictions about what exactly the strategy wants to and can achieve, and by what means. And this is the second basic aspect. Because of the economic dynamics and increasing security and stability, East and South Asia have been perceived for a few years now as a coherent, decisive, and thus strategically important space for the future of Europe. The focus is therefore on the continuation of a so-called open, rule-based order. This is characterized by inclusive multilateral cooperation based on common values and principles. And the German guidelines on the Indo-Pacific explicitly mention the United Nations system, international agreements on the protection of human rights, disarmament and arms control, and, in particular, the international law of the sea. In fact, the connection of the Pacific and Indian Oceans via the sea roads through Southeast Asia is indispensable to the idea of an Indo-Pacific region. As we can see on this slide from an Australian policy paper. Accordingly, the need for greater security engagement by extra-regional actors is primarily justified by threats to freedom of navigation, especially from China's expansion into the South China Sea. In many respects, a 2016 arbitration ruling brought by the Philippines against China confirms this general assessment. In addition, the liberal international order as a whole would be in a crisis. This becomes particularly clear when official documents, such as the Australian Defence White Paper of 2016, see the international order that has existed for 70 years as being under threat and seek to defend it even by military means. In fact, however, in the decades since 1945, there has not only been prosperity and peace. The Cold War, especially in East Asia, was not cold but extremely violent. For this reason, and also in view of the upheavals of '89 and '91 and after 9/11, it is difficult to speak of an unchanged and prosperous order for all. And thus, the politically irrelevant understandings of the rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific also differ. And now regarding AUKUS. The undiplomatic approach aside, the deal highlights the dynamics of the trans-Pacific variant of the rule-based order. Thus, for American decision-makers, quite officially, the primary concern is to maintain their hegemonic or even military primacy. This primacy this is based on the alliances with Japan, South Korea and Australia, and corresponding efforts have been directed primarily against China since the 1990s. This is the consensus in Australia and Japan. And despite the military cooperation that has deepened greatly over the years, the problem for the partners on both sides of the Pacific is, paradoxically, that one can never do enough for the other, that one can never cooperate enough with the other. And since military successes failed to materialize in the Middle East and the global financial crisis of 2008 revealed the weakness of the USA and the supposed strength of China, the search is on for further partners, especially in Tokyo and Canberra. This is why Australian and Japanese strategists became interested in geopolitical concepts such as the Indo-Pacific early on. Here we have the security diamonds presented by the Prime Minister of Japan in 2012. And the conclusion of AUKUS illustrates this dynamic, since these concepts make two things possible. On the one hand, it makes Australia an even closer military, more capable partner of the US, also regarding China, and a kind of security. And of course, it makes a geographic expansion possible. And this is where the difficulty or the contradiction to be overcome lies, even within the European Indo-Pacific strategies. How can a conflict between the great powers, China and the US, with its allies be prevented without giving in to China's expansionist aspirations? And how can a rule-based order such as the US be protected without the use of military means and the instrumentalization of law undermining it? I have a few proposals. Firstly, China policies should focus on the essential problems regarding mainly the oppression of ethnic minorities, the desired incorporation of Taiwan into the People's Republic, and the exaggerated claim to the South China Sea. And a critical, even transatlantic dialogue on the pluralistic and dynamically developing international order, like during the Cold War, after the Cold War, and now, could drastically reduce the existing threat perceptions. Indeed, instead of the hegemonic position of the USA as we know it or knew it, or instead of a renewed bipolarity between the US and China, the struggle for a multitude of spheres of influence seems to have flared up. This is evident, for example, in the fact that freedom of navigation is understood as a national rather than a global good, and that regional maritime disputes are increasingly being elevated to issues of international order. This development, this can be countered by giving priority to the interests of the numerous smaller actors without geopolitical ambitions, who are inevitably marginalized by the focus on value partners with highly capable naval forces. I think the European strategy or the EU strategy for cooperation in Indo-Pacific can realize this, but we must be aware of the fact that there's a kind of clash of orders going on and what this would mean for the European Union and its member state. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to a very fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, and please have a seat. Then our panel will be more complete, so please just come up and sit down. So then we have Professor Deitelhoff on the left-hand side and MEP McAllister. Thank you so much, Dr. Wirth. So on my right-hand side, I have the MEP David McAllister, and since 2017 he has been the president of the Committee for Foreign Affairs in the European Parliament, and he is also in a committee for trade, and also when it comes to US relations, NATO, and of course, also Minister of Niedersachsen. Thank you so much for being here. On my left-hand side, I have Professor Deitelhoff. She is part of the committee of the Leibniz Institute of the Foundation for Peace and Conflict Studies of Hesse of the Goethe University of Frankfurt am Main. And then, of course, we also We have Professor Schmidt. She's the president of the research committee about normative orders of the Goethe University Frankfurt. And thank you. And finally, also on my left-hand side, Dr. Brender. Since 2017, he is the leader of the European Office for Foreign Affairs for the department covering Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. And he has also worked here in Brussels at the EU, but he's also working for the newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and he studied, among others, history, and he has done his PhD at the university in Freiburg. Thank you so much for being here. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, this is really a high-ranking panel discussion, and I would like to start with you, dear Deputy McAllister. You said that the EU will reinforce its position when it comes to the discussion about global tensions, and that the fundament here is really moral values, and that we need an inclusive and a flexible approach. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. So what do you think that when it comes to the European Parliament, what are the goals? What is the approach? Well, first I would like to say that the Office for Foreign Affairs of the European Union, that they started this strategy because there already had been different strategies from the national member states, among others Germany and France. So it's really good to have a common paper. I think it's a very good paper, very good position paper. And this paper is also based on just general approaches in the European Union from the last 10 to 15 years. So we already have strategic partners in the Pacific area. So also when it comes to the economic side and also democratic side. So India, Southern Korea, and we also have some trade agreements with some states, with South Korea since 2011, and Singapore and Vietnam. And the European Union also managed to have a strategic partnership. So, I mean, we already have done a lot in the past years and decades. In general, you can say that the European Union is the most important and biggest direct investor in the region. So for a lot of countries, it is the most important trading partner, but also when it comes to the developmental cooperation. So, okay, let's look at it in detail. We want to represent our European interests in a dynamic way. Dr. Wirth talked already about the fact that this region is already very marked by a dynamic from the US on the one hand side and China on the other hand side. And that, of course, started a geopolitical competition. So the European Union has to take position because the Indo-Pacific is really the central point for global trade. So we have our own interest that this region stays geopolitically stable and that it's possible to have safe trading routes. So, Josep Borrell, the representative there already started with it, and we have two papers, one to the trading report and the other one is it's in the Department of Defense, and I will actually present that. And then finally, what I find especially well established is that we have a general and comprehensive approach. So we want to be a loyal and trustworthy partner, trading partner for many partners. I already named a few of them. And of course, it's a strategic approach that doesn't just cover questions of defense or security, but we're also talking about connectivity, we're talking about safe trading, safety and security in general, and then also about climate change. So it's about the Indo-Pacific. And even though that area hasn't really been focused on in the past years, now it's absolutely focused on. So a couple of years ago, this was almost a term that you didn't use. You only used it in the US and in Delhi. And we have a more a broader approach, actually. So the Indo-Pacific is from the Horn of Africa until Latin America. And that is because we have this holistic approach. So we know that between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, there's also so much space. So we are absolutely interested in safe trading routes. Europe, on the one hand side, is really far away from the Indo-Pacific, but through France, we're actually also represented locally. So 1.5 million of EU of people living in the EU actually live in the EU in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you so much. Yes, this is really important for the EU and for their trading connections. You were also already talking about security and safety and defense. That was very interesting. But now maybe first Dr. Brender. So the European Office for Foreign Affairs, how do you actually want to apply this strategy? So we were talking about the fact that a couple of years ago it was said that it's not critical, it's not an open confrontation with China, but at the same time it's also we're not just waving through China, so it's an open strategy and debate. So how do you want to apply that strategy in detail? So maybe you could be a bit more concrete. Yes, so I wasn't actually the leader, I was just the second leader of this delegation. That was important. Okay, so yes, I will maybe repeat a little bit what my colleague said. So this is really very important for us. Also this region, yes, it's far away, but it's of utmost importance what happens there. Indeed, this region will become more and more important, both economically and demographically, and there are more and more tensions, political tensions. So central stakeholders like China will play a role, and these tensions will intensify. So we need to make sure that this becomes more stable. The central message here is that we as Europe want to make sure that this region is stable, peaceful, that it prospers, and that it will be autonomous in a way. And also, what are these strategies in detail? Well, I would like to underline what you said. It's a very balanced approach, so it's not about reducing China's influence. It's really a balanced approach, so we're cooperating with Japan, Australia, India, and of course the US. So we do have partners that together with us want to become active in this region and that also are active in this region, and this is something we want to build on. So Mr. McAllister already talked about that, so this is nothing new, but we actually already have had a cooperation for several years and we want to build on that. So now we want to actually further our goals with our partners. So in detail, that means that we want to continue our action in different political fields. So when we're talking about trade, that of course is very important. And then that is also accompanied by the topic of climate change. That of course is very important also when it comes to our politics of foreign affairs. And of course maritime politics, sea politics. So when it comes to natural resources, but also biodiversity and safeguarding biodiversity, and digital governance and partnerships is also a very important topic, especially in that area. South Korea, Japan, those are solid partners for us in this. And there will also be a new communication from the Parliament and the Commission about this topic, and also when it comes to human safety. I mean, that also has to do with questions of health. So, I mean, those is one dimension, but there are several dimensions to that. Finally, I would like to say that when we're talking about the success of our strategy, so how can we make sure that we will be successful, then I think we have to say that it depends on us to a grand part. So, I mean, the strategy is just 1 month old. So really, I mean, when we're talking about how can a strategy be in crisis if the strategy has just been presented? I mean, I really have to object here. And the English title is not as poignant as the German one. So it really depends on us. And this question, I'm just going to reiterate it. That depends also how the member states see that. We have one member state, France, and this state indeed is part of the Indo-Pacific region, but 26 other member states are not part of the Indo-Pacific region. So do we have the political will for this strategy? And I mean, that also connects to what our goals are. So we really have to continue with that debate. Our success depends on a European consensus. And I mean, we've just started. So this is really a long-term strategy. And I think we also have to remember that. When we're then talking about finance, we have to see, okay, is it enough? And to be honest, we have some financial resources, but they are quite limited. So that is why I really want to reiterate it as a cooperational strategy. We're working with some partners, and then maybe we can also share the burden and also share the work. Here it's also important to say that the economy must play an important role also when we're talking about connectivity. So, I mean, we're not just talking about public finances, we're also talking about the private economic sector in the EU. So that was it from my side. And I just wanted to say that our partners reacted very positively. So Australia, India, the US, the High Representative started a dialogue about the Indo-Pacific. So we do want to start a cooperation that is of utmost importance. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we want to take a step back. Since we have also Professor Dr. Nicole Deitelhoff, it's a rule-based order, the values as the foundation of the cooperative strategy of the European Union. And I have one basic question. Mr. Wirth said that the European strategy is not in a crisis, and Mr. Brender indicates that this would even be impossible since the paper is only 4 weeks old. And you have been working on multilateralism in crisis and so on. And Mr. McAllister says that there must be more multilateralism and not less. So you as an expert in crisis, do we have a crisis or do we not have a crisis? What are we talking about? Yes, I would agree saying that this crisis rather concerns the Indo-Pacific region and not our strategy. And this would require much more commitment from the European member states. And here we have also the territorial requests and then the freedom of passage and the seas. So many different questions. And here we have a kind of crisis. And here we are currently being in a kind of phases of strategic reorientation, repositioning. Regarding the US, we have a very stable strategy in the Indo-Pacific, also including containment and rollback regarding China. Now, Europe has been very discreet for long years, but now we see that with Biden, there have been more proactive strategies, are being formulated, and this is not yet the last word. And for the European Union, the question is how close do we want to be to the US approach, or do we rather want an autonomous European strategy? And in my point of view, we really should try a European strategy in order to have kind of freedom of maneuver regarding China and the USA. It's not about the European Union between China and the US, but it's about developing negotiation possibilities when both great powers are affronting each other. Then Europe has other interests regarding China than the US, and therefore I think it's important we must analyze field of action, every field of action apart in order to see what are our red lines and where do we want to become active. This is much more comprehensive and intensive than just approaching and joining the US strategy. Thank you. One more question for you, Mr. Wirth. As we hear, the economic questions are very important for the European Union, and then we have smaller islands. And how comes that we now have the intensification of conflicts now resulting in an EU strategy? How can you explain this? Yes, I think this has to be examined, how this tension has been developing over years. I would say that the institutions and the ideas of order since the 50s are now in a crisis. And this is mainly the Communist Party in China. There are really huge changes and making the Communist Party more and more authoritarian. And then we have the partners, the US and its partners in the Pacific, whose considerations are also partly in a crisis. And now the question is, how can we stabilize this situation? And therefore, I think we should examine this tension. How could this kind of tension between different actors develop? And I think really the maritime sphere played a decisive role. And there were two origins where different nationalisms and historical perceptions got centralized. Now we have the islands between China and Japan. It's only stone. Nobody is living there. And in 2008, both head of states almost found the solutions, but afterwards things escalated and exploded. And then we have the question regarding the allowed military actions, and China tries to instrumentalize the international maritime law to keep US activities away from its coast. And these both approaches had come consequence an increase in the tensions. And in 2001, we had the US plane for reconnaissance had to make an emergency landing. Yeah, after 20 years, we had maneuvers, war vessels in the different papers. And Mr. McAllister, regarding the maritime security, you said that you can contribute regarding this topic. And you said that there would be a need of political will in order to be a global actor. So let's come back to the question of a military intervention. You said different member states are on side, but how could this come together or go together with the cooperation as described by Professor Deitelhoff? So how could you do this balance between cooperation and a military strategy? Yeah, as Mr. Brender said, this strategy has a comprehensive approach. It's not only security and defensive policies. There are much more or many more different fields of action where the European Union should engage and intervene. But this strategy is also about how the European Union can position itself as an actor in security policies. And here we should take the existing partnerships as a basis. Okay, we have these partnerships with South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, India, Australia, and so on. And then on this basis, we should try to create a kind of network in order to construct a real security partnership. This should be the way to go, of course, in accordance with our most important partner, the United States of America. But I must agree, we should agree with the US, but of course we'll not share the opinion for every single point, and therefore we have to keep some independence. And if I resume, we can say that 3 C's should make our China policy: be cooperate where possible, compete when necessary, and confront when needed. Once more, cooperation when it's possible. And China still is a very important cooperation partner. Let's think about climate policy. Without China's engagement, we'll not be able to handle these challenges. Okay, we are in favor of a competition with China, but it must be a competition, economic competition, with a level playing field. And now, and I agree with you, of course, China is also a strategic competitor, and China and its communist leadership has a whole different, very different perception of a state of law and democracy. And what worries us is that we see China becoming more and more aggressive, be it vis-à-vis Hong Kong, the South China Sea and Taiwan and so on. And all these intimidations. And now the question is how to handle a giant like China. First of all, we have to make proof of solidarity. China has to know that there are many powers in the world believing in the force of law and not in the law of the strong. Okay, and if multilateralism has been weakened, it is very important that the nation states convinced by this philosophy must come together and continue to develop their activities. Let me mention Canada. And I think Canada will follow a comparable strategy. So we must join. We must show China that there are limits and that we are not, or that we will not accept its aggressivity. And I think that the Chinese leadership appreciates much more a clear communication than timidity. So we really can take a strong position regarding China. And now, last point, regarding the activities of the Federal Marines in this region. Okay, this one frigate was very important from a political, symbolic point of view. We had to show that we know what's happening here, and with this one ship, we show what we are doing.
Thank you so much. Maybe when it comes to the Research Institute of Hesse for Peace and Conflict Studies, how do you position yourself in that? Well, first, when we're talking about the CCC strategy, we have to make sure that China doesn't just develop further and further and untangle. So we must make sure that doesn't happen, and that the different relationships remain balanced. So that is what we need to make sure also with our political actions. And when we're talking about networking, that means, okay, we need to find partners that think alike in that region, but really often these partners have conflicts among each other. So it's not that simple to build up a network with which we can interact regularly. So I just wanted to state that. Thank you so much. Dr. Brender, maybe do you agree we need an inclusive, cooperative approach that also has some red lines? So is that also your approach, or do you want to add something? No, I think that MEP McAllister and Professor Deitelhoff have said that correctly. It's not a strategy that focuses on reducing the influence of China. It's really about trade, for example, Iran. So, we do cooperate with China in some aspects, but in other aspects, especially when we're talking about the communistic system, etc., there we really have very different ideas. But I think it's very important that the EU can't act as a sole player, and we can't do it on our own. So we do need partners. We do need countries that think alike, states that think alike. And that is why, and unfortunately it's true what you said, that a lot of conflicts among them. True. Maybe back to the EU, and there we also need to have a consensus first, but maybe we're going to talk about that in our next session. And so the EU wants to have this mediating strategy, and there is also another approach. They have the AUKUS cooperation. So the president of the German French Association from Frankfurt asked why the EU didn't react more vehemently when it came to breaching the contract. The EU is supposed to be the partner of the USA, and so once again the UK has is a traitor in a way. That was just a very unfortunate turn of events, because also when you look at the timetable, it was at the same time we were talking about the question about the submarines and the Indo-Pacific, and of course there are different opinions about that, but maybe it was just pure coincidence. And of course I understand that our NATO partner France is disappointed, because it's about economic and military interests, and it was decided that when it comes to the renewal of the submarines, Australia decided to not go ahead with France, And there's just something that we have to accept. The timing was really unfortunate, and President Biden himself said that it was very clumsy. But what does AUKUS mean? Well, we will see if that is just about Australian submarines or more. But France remains a central player in the Pacific with a lot of maritime area and 1.5 million European nationals. And it would have made sense to include Europe. So why that didn't happen, that we need to ask. But at the end, we stated that we find it very unfortunate, but at the same time we need to look ahead. And also when it comes to the different trading conversations, that has been postponed. Thank you so much. Great. Then maybe about the one last topic, because we only have a couple of minutes left. So maybe Dr. Deitelhoff can start. We can't talk about Joseph Borrell and talk about the EU as a political force when we're not talking about a delegation that was sent to Taiwan. So maybe let's talk about Taiwan. Well, thank you. Taiwan is, after Hong Kong, the second case where China tries to change everything despite all agreements. So we just watched how Hong Kong was robbed from many freedoms. So are we really ready to risk a nuclear conflict for Taiwan? You can make a parallel here to Berlin during the Cold War. Well, what do the diplomats say? Well, it was a delegation from the European Parliament that was sent out to Taiwan. And I want to state that we worry about this development. That is a development that is very worrisome. And there are no simple answers. So, of course, we have to talk with China or the partners, and it's a process. So it's important to say that it's a mega project that is really a long-term thing that won't just be concluded after 1 year, but several years. So how can we help? Thank you so much. Dr. Wirth, maybe you're an expert for this region. So when we're thinking globally, what do you say about Taiwan? Well, that is a key question, maybe the central question. And I think what we have to ask ourselves is, how do we achieve stability, especially when it comes to the situation also with Taiwan, and especially the Taiwanese. So we really have to listen to the smaller countries like Taiwan, South Korea. So we also have to exchange with them, not just with the big countries. Thank you so much. And then maybe MEP McAllister, please. The European Parliament took a clear position towards Taiwan, and it was clearer than the 27 national member states were maybe able to. So Taiwan is a parliamentary democracy, and Taiwan has structures of a state of law, and there is freedom of press, all of which doesn't exist in China. So that is why Taiwan is a partner for our politics of foreign affairs, a like-minded partner, because these values exist. So it was important for us to show solidarity. Taiwan, and the other speakers already said so, is very much intimidated, China intimidates it a lot, and that is not right. So we, as a European Parliament, have to also take a stance and also make sure that Taiwan becomes a bigger part of the international community, like the World Trade Organization, because Taiwan really does deliver a surplus and an additional value for the international community. So that was courageous, and it was one of the first high official delegations of the European Parliament. And even though China tried to make sure that that wouldn't happen, I'm very happy that the colleagues went anyway. Thank you so much for this discussion, and thank you so much to all the colleagues. So thank you, Professor Deitelhoff, Professor Brender, MEP McAllister, and Dr. Wirth. There was such a interesting discussion, and I hope, ladies and gentlemen, you were thinking the same thing. So I think this is a great conclusion. Thank you so much for joining in and being part of this discussion. And I would like to invite you to another panel debate in Brussels. Again, it's at 1 p.m. and it's 75 years of the Constitution of Hesse, the role of the regions in Europe. Thank you so much and have a great day.